Hello, puppies and kittens. Welcome to another episode of Matter of Fact Science. And this series was the brainchild of my wife and co host, Lalandra Ra, who is participating tonight. Thank you very much to her. I also want to thank our producer, Peter DeTucker, and him and AJ, Atheist Jr., who will be monitoring the chat and selecting relevant questions for tonight's guest. Our guest tonight is Joseph Felsenstein. He's an emeritus professor in the Departments of Genome Sciences and Biology at the University of Washington in Seattle, and he is a pioneer developer in systematic phylogenetics, who not only has evolutionary concepts and algorithms bearing his name, but also has a species of butterfly that was named after him. And more impressive than that, at least to me, is that he was also awarded the Darwin Wallace Medal by the Linnean Society in 2008. And I covet that. Very much respect. Welcome to the show, Professor Felsenstein. My apologies.
Hello.
All right, so I want to get into. I know that I've seen a number of your presentations, and you talk a lot about the history of phylogenetics, and the first thing I think we need to get into is some discussion of clarification of what is or was taxonomy. How does that compare to phylogenetics? What's the difference? But I've noticed that you have a tendency to make a distinction between, say, cladists and systematists, although you have a different pronunciation for that, and I don't understand what that is. So if you might please offer some definitions so that the audience has some idea what we're talking about today.
Well, I think, first of all, I'll have to ask you, is my voice loud enough?
Yes.
Because I'm having trouble hearing myself. I basically came into evolutionary biology working in an area called theoretical population genetics, which is mathematical calculations of the changes of gene frequencies in populations. And I was doing math on that. Then I got involved with evolutionary trees. And I didn't come in as a systematist. Systematist is a person who is basically trying to order animals, plants, protists, bacteria, make some sort of a classification system, organize their information in museum collections and other ways. And they tend to be focused on the classification system. And the classification systems developed from the 1700s on. I came in as somebody working on evolutionary biology at the population level, and then I got involved with how you make evolutionary trees, how you make, they're called phylogenies. And so I really wasn't that interested in the classification system. And I got to know taxonomists, systematists who were taxonomists, maintaining the taxonomic system. They thought very differently from the way I did. And so I've tended to concentrate over the years on methods for making inferences about the tree of life, the evolutionary tree, without trying to prejudge how you then organize a classification system into groups. And that's been very controversial because a lot of systematists think of the classification system as the central task of systematics. And I just think of, well, for evolutionary biologists, the evolutionary tree is what matters. So I tend to make a distinction there between trying to find out things about the evolutionary tree and trying to make a classification system. And there are other people who don't really think there should be any distinction there at all, that we shouldn't even think about, that we should always put one into the terminology, the other, basically. And by the way, with regard to the word cladistics, the people I actually ended up fighting with a lot were very fervent about being called cladists. And so, you know, although I think the classification system has ended up, their scheme of doing everything genealogically has won out as it should. They tend to think of me as not a cladist for some reason. So I think we're going to have various misunderstandings about the word cladistics.
Yeah, I
But
was worried about that.
I'll stop there.
I was worried about that. It was actually one of the questions that I had for you. Was I saw one of your discussions where you made a distinction between systematists, or I can't even say it the way that you say it. I apologize. Systematists.
People often call it, say, systematists.
Okay. But you were drawing and you mentioned somewhere that that it all depends on what you mean by cladists and cladistics. And for me, cladistics means that, of course, that we hold to monophyletic clades. I don't think that anybody does paraphyletic clades, right? I mean, they're all monophyletic.
Oh, if they're called a clade, they're monophyletic, which for our audience, I should say, means that they're a group, which is that every group you make is a group consisting of an ancestor and all of its descendants.
So what you're saying is that there's no point in evolutionary history where one kind ever turned into or changed into another fundamentally different kind.
I don't know. This starts to get into what you mean by a kind. I think it's certainly true that populations of organisms have evolved through time and have changed a lot.
Yeah, it's one of the arguments that irritates me when we have a new species of fruit fly or finch, or whatever type of fish. Then they say, well, it didn't evolve because creationists would be saying it didn't evolve because it's still a fly or it's still a finch, as if a fly is supposed to give birth to a tree or something like that, so that something is so distantly related that it's not even related to its own parents anymore. And clearly, that's a straw man fallacy, and I'm at pains to get people to understand that.
Well, it's also when people, I mean, that gets all involved in the creationists like to talk about what they call kinds, and kinds are not species; they're some larger group, but it's kind of flexible. They get to decide what is a kind and what is not a kind. And actually, that all goes back to trying to figure out how many animals were on the ark. Because as systematists and evolutionary biologists discovered that there were very large numbers of species out there, that kind of overloaded the ark. And so people had to think of some way to have the ark carry the animals from here to there without having too much on board. And so they started coming up with a scheme of the ark would carry certain organisms, and then they would come out, and then they would hyper evolve into all the ones we see. This is bizarre.
So they don't believe in macroevolution. They believe in a super duper hyper caffeinated electro mega evolution.
Well, yes, but within these kinds, and they don't believe in anything happening that could get you from one kind to another. And when you say, well, what do you mean by a kind? They will wave their hands and say, oh, basically different structure, et cetera, like jellyfish versus starfish, or humans versus chimpanzees, which kind of defeats the whole thing.
So I wanted to ask you about the concept of monophyly and that thing that the creationists argue about, that one kind changes into another fundamentally different kind, that argument we always hear. I have to remind people that according to the law of monophyly, that you can never grow out of your ancestry, that every new generation, whether it's a new species or genus or whatever, is always a modified version of whatever its ancestors were. It never became something different than its ancestors were. So, of course, a new species of fruit fly would still be a fruit fly, just be a new species of that.
That also means we're fish.
Statistically, yes.
Yeah. So, Neil Shubin has a book, Your Inner Fish.
Yeah, I hope to get him on this show at some point. I would love to have an interview with him. But what I wanted to ask you about was that I find that in explaining evolution to people, they want me to identify a past form that led to the current form. And so I find that some paraphyly is kind of necessary to give the explanation. When we're talking about human evolution, for example, I have to refer to paraphyletic groups like Parapithecidae or Proplyopithecodea, or Australopithecus, for example, because we know that humanity is in some way rooted to a species that would be classified within that group. Can you speak to that?
Well, I would tend not to talk much about the taxonomic groups and just say Australopithecus afarensis or something like that. And that's a particular species, and we can then talk about that species as being ancestral to us. A very hardcore cladist, by the way, won't let you do that. They want to have everything split off, and so they will say, well, you can never tell, you can never identify a form in the past as having been the ancestor. They say it's not possible to infer ancestral descendant relationships. I think it actually is if you have enough information. I think, for example, we can be pretty sure that what we would call either Homo ergaster or Homo erectus really was our ancestor, and not just something that can't be told from the ancestor. And that's because we've collected enough, we've dug up enough fossils in Africa that if our ancestor were there and were something else, we would have seen it by now.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, and have used that argument myself, that our species that's the only example where we can say that this specific species came from this specific species, because Homo erectus was in Europe. It was across tropical Asia, Indonesia, Africa, and they were so dispersed, and all of the else that we know about the paleoanthropological lineage kind of implies that we had to have emerged from that group.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So
we may be wrong, but I think we're not.
I agreed. It's possible to be wrong, but it's a safe assumption at this point. Another question, which reminds me, I needed to ask something about assumptions too, because one of the criticisms that I've gotten from some Muslim apologists is that somehow evolution is invalidated by the fact that it involves assumptions, but they won't tell me what the assumptions are that supposedly negate the confidence of science. And I often think that the assumptions are that there's a mind-independent reality. Maybe that's one of the assumptions they're talking about. You mentioned in one of your presentations about assumptions about the correlation between radiometric dating and mitochondrial or the molecular clock dating, which to my experience seems to line up pretty well. But yeah, I think you have an explanation for why that is, don't you?
I'm not sure what you're talking about, actually. I'm sorry.
You were giving an explanation about how the molecular clock was worked out, because we had fixed dates that were absolute dates by radiometric dating. And then we were trying to, that people were trying to work out the rate of significant mutations according to the molecular clock.
Well, I think that we're probably referring to when people were calibrating the molecular clock.
Exactly.
One of the ways you can do it is to take a fossil such as, based on the fossil record, if you come to the conclusion that the human and orangutan lineage separated, say, 18 million years ago, and that was the figure they were using then, may have been changed since then.
I think 15 million is what they're saying now, but I can't.
Say it's 15, and then you look at the mitochondria in humans, and you look at the corresponding mitochondria in orangutans. You basically count differences, although you sometimes have to correct for distances that might have overwritten each other, and then you can get a sense of how much difference accumulates per million years. I should say that I'm a theoretician. I work on theoretical properties of statistical methods for estimating evolutionary trees. And if this discussion gets into the nitty-gritty of exactly what each molecule is doing in the cell, you'll find that I won't be very informative about that.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about that, as I think we've probably gone over the level already that I wanted to. because I know that I had trouble following some of your lectures, so I don't know what the audience is doing right now. We're not talking to professional scientists for the most part. This audience is people who are interested in science, maybe not necessarily educated in science.
I wanted to back up some. Can you
Okay.
hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
My background isn't as advanced as yours in science, and it's more like science communication. Now, with what you're saying with clades as opposed to the old Linnaean taxonomy, like I taught science before, and the children, King Philip came over for good spaghetti, kingdom, phylum, class, order,
Oh, okay.
and
Yeah.
aim too, right? Now with that, there seems to be a way to get from one node to another, even though there's one that's wrong, like birds and dinosaurs.
Yeah.
They're separate, but like if we were talking about Neostrumens, your inner fish, and that we're fish. We're fish in every way that a fish is a fish, similarity wise. Any way you could describe a fish, right? Like they have hearts, that kind of thing. So like that's how we're grouping clades, but sometimes it's useful to notice differences too. So how do you get there with monophyly? I can't pronounce it correctly.
Well, I think most these days it's pronounced monophyly. Yeah, I think the ideal scheme of classification, when people talk about cladistic classification, is that you'll have an evolutionary tree, and characters will be arising along this evolutionary tree. And if you have a character that arises, a new state of it arises at a certain point in the tree, and if everything is perfect, then it exists after that and doesn't exist anywhere else on the tree. Then the presence of that character will define a branch on the tree where it first arose, and that will define a monophyletic group. You get variety of characters popping up at different points in the tree, but real life is a little more complicated than this idealized scheme. And sometimes, for example, in molecules, you look at a certain point in a DNA sequence and you see a letter A, and then as you go up the tree, at some point that A might change to a C. You get a nucleotide substitution. Well, it could be that further up the tree, it would happen to substitute back to A again. So you'll get some inconsistencies in the tree as a result of multiple changes in a single character. And a lot of the statistics we do is to try to get a handle on that and try not to be fooled too much and get some idea what the degree of error we might have in making the tree. In terms of taxonomy, in the old days, people made what are called paraphyletic groups. That is, there were groups that consist of an ancestor and most of its descendants, but not some of them. The classic example is reptiles. We used to have the class Reptilia, and that consisted of all the things we would call reptiles: lizards, snakes, crocodilians, turtles, a few other things, one other thing, mostly the tuatara. But it didn't include birds and it didn't include mammals. But birds and mammals are descended from the common ancestor of all reptiles. So the minute you take out the birds and the minute you take out the mammals, the group that's left is not any longer an ancestor and all of its descendants. It's an ancestor and those descendants that are left over, and that's a paraphyletic group. So, these characters arising on a tree define the structure of a tree, but there's a little bit of noise in that, and you have to get down into statistical approaches. And the old classification system did not completely correspond to groups on the tree. You couldn't take a pair of shears. Here's a tree. Okay, you can't take a pair of shears, cut off a branch of the tree, and get some of those old groups because they were paraphyletic. So if you look at a modern classification of vertebrates, for example, there isn't any class Reptilia anymore. There are some particular subgroups of what used to be reptiles, but there's not an overall class called reptiles. I don't know if that comes close. Does that come anywhere near answer? I may have wandered off your question.
No, I think you did. You did fine. I think a clearer example for the laity would probably be snakes and lizards. I mean, I think even the religious fundamentalists accept that snakes began as lizards, that they had legs at one time. But it's not like that a snake or a lizard losing legs necessarily is the thing that makes it a snake. But when it becomes a snake, it has in our vernacular, a snake is no longer a lizard. Somehow a snake is not considered it's part of squamata, but people don't realize that means lizard. So it's like you stop being a lizard when you become a snake, in the same way that you stop being a dinosaur when you become a bird. Now, neither is true cladistically, but this is the way common people kind of look at it.
Yeah. And, there was a period when lots and lots of invertebrates got called worms. Any invertebrate that was, long and thin basically got called a worm. And we now look, even 200 years ago, people were looking in detail at them and discovering that some of these things called worms were very wildly unlike each other. But people have a way of, if it doesn't look like us, it tends to get, people tend to start ignoring the differences.
One of the reasons that I became interested in taxonomy way early on, I was like in second grade, and one of my teachers gave me a book on dinosaurs that happened to include, the 1970 version of a cladogram, and it just illustrated how things belong together. It surprises me that people can look at a goat and a cow and a dog and a cat and not realize that they're looking at two different groups here, 4 animals representing 2 groups. How is it that other people don't understand this? I don't know, but it gives me an idea of where I am. And I know a lot of other people don't need that. They don't know which was invented first, the television or the car. And they don't know where they are chronologically. I know a lot of people who can't tell you what other state or country is north, south, east, or west of them. I'm not one of those people who is comfortable being lost that way. I want to know where I am chronologically, geographically, and taxonomically.
Yeah, I think in the history of taxonomy, an important period was in the 1500s and 1600s, when you got a lot of Europeans going out and doing international explorations for the purpose, various purposes of trade and conquest. And they started finding animals and plants that were grossly different from the ones they were used to in Europe. And that sort of raised the issue of, well, how do we keep track of these? We live in Europe with a list of known animals and known plants, but suddenly here were new things. And I think that's what raised the need for a classification of some sort and for collections.
You mentioned in a paragraph you'd written somewhere that you had been doing recently, you'd been looking at mathematical arguments that were proposed by creationists.
Yeah. That's another.
I'm wondering whether that includes David Berlinski's argument that whale evolution required too many mutations to have taken place in only 10 or 20 million years or so.
Yeah, that's really other people than Berlinski who have raised that. He's just repeating that. And for that, they feel very sure that you can't get from this form to that form. The rest of us are less sure. When you do the molecules, when you look at DNA or proteins from whales and you look at them from other mammals, you find, in fact, that the whales and dolphins and whales and dolphins form a clade, and that clade connects to the ungulates, to hoofed animals, particularly to artiodactyls, and the closest relative of whales is, from the molecular data, is pretty clearly the two species of hippopotamus. That's really been nailed down by molecular data in recent years, but it actually had been suspected by people working on detailed anatomy, for example, of the ear. There are some modifications of ear bones that are present in hippopotamus and are also present in whales, for example. So that had been suspected on anatomical grounds, and then the molecules come in and basically nail it down.
One of the common creationist arguments is to take any one fact and say, well, that doesn't prove anything, because no one fact by itself would generally prove anything. That would be logically true most of the time. But I don't know how these people can disassociate whales from artiodactyls when we have so many different species of four-legged whale now.
This is a tangent on like the whale and the hippopotami or hippopotamus or missus question. What do you think of the depictions of ancestor whales that had legs? Because like, if we found a hippopotamus skull today, will we illustrate it correctly, what it actually looks like in action? Will we have this big stout, with a big bulbous nose, Like, what do you think of the depictions of the ancestor walking whales?
Well, I think I'm not an anatomist, but I think generally the people who are doing those know what they're doing. And the whale fossil story is very interesting because up until fairly recently, there were hardly any whale fossils, and very commonly creationists said, "Aha, you can't evolve a whale." And then some people, in particular Philip Gingerich in University of Michigan, went out and was searching for whale fossils and was very successful. And there's now a whole series of forms of ancestors of whales, relatives of the ancestors of whales, that have where they're able to. They had limbs that you could see, 4 limbs, and they can walk on land.
I think there's a 5th or 6th species of four-legged walking whale that's just been announced like a week ago.
Yeah, they haven't. There's a bunch. I'm not the one to ask which is which. I'm a theoretician. In terms of arguing with creationists, what I've tended to do, my original training is in the mathematics of theoretical population genetics. When questions like that come up, that's how I got involved, really. I started seeing creationists in discussions on the internet saying things that were wrong about population genetics, and then I had the technical background, so I would go argue with them. More recently, also got involved in arguments about common ancestry. There's been massive discussions of that on the web, and I don't think creationists deal with it very well. They won't admit that it's very hard to get them to admit that different groups could have any common ancestry at all. The pattern we see in nature of groups within groups within groups reflects the evolutionary tree. And I think that they really can't cope with that. So I tend to get involved in various blogs in arguments with creationists, and mostly it's most useful when I have some technical knowledge of, for example, methods for inferring phylogenies, for reconstructing evolutionary trees, or the mathematics of population genetics. That's really where I can have my input.
Well, we share a field of interest, you professionally, me on an amateur level. I had managed a few years ago to get funding to start a project whose an endeavor to classify the entire taxonomic tree of life as a single navigable online resource. And that we've been working on that with a couple dozen volunteers, including a number of computer engineers for a few years. And we logged 70,000 taxa manually. And for the last year or so at least, we've been trying to integrate another 2.6 million taxa from a different web source. And then we have to find ways of integrating that into the system. And it's not all available without a login right now, so I can't show it to you. So I'm enormously frustrated with that.
Yeah.
But it is, we have created the single biggest dendrogram ever.
Well,
Just hands
yeah,
down.
you mentioned that, and you also mentioned, I think you're well aware of previous efforts to do similar things. The one I'm best familiar with is Tree of Life, which
Arizona Tree of Life project.
yeah, which David Madison and others did starting in the early 2000s, and they ran out of money in the end. But I think it's still there. I think you can. Isn't it tolweb.org?
It is, and
Yeah.
the sad thing is it is still there. It's in serious need of update, but it's not going to happen. And a
No,
lot of
it's
that
not.
was because the funding, which was substantial, went to a handful of PhDs to basically build a website. So you had at least a half a dozen doctoral degree people, and they're building a website. So you can imagine how costly that was. My entire team is volunteer for that.
Well, I
very
think,
reason.
I know David. I don't know if you've talked to him, but I think he would. Are you importing information from that one?
No. We are
Talk to
going to
David.
peer-reviewed sites. Most of our stuff has been manually put in from Fossil Works, and we've been concentrating on extinct things. But then there's another website like EOL, I think it's called, and I can't remember what that stands for. But they had another 2.6 million taxa that are
Was
all
that like
extant.
something like Encyclopedia of Life?
Encyclopedia of Life, yes.
Yeah,
So we've
yeah.
been integrating
There's
data
been
from that.
those efforts too.
And so
So,
the goal that we have is to create a cladogram dendrogram that is peer reviewed ultimately, and would serve some value as a educational resource.
now you'll come up to some points where there are areas of the tree people are still debating about, and you'll have to have some way of representing uncertainty too. So I don't know how you're handling that.
We have to put in a subsequent tree when we get into pterosaurs. There has to be an article attached to that you can explain, like with pterosaurs, because we don't have any molecular data. Then we have like 2 well-supported trees. Either one are considered. Either one is effectively equally popular. Yeah. So we are addressing that.
Yeah, and as you go further back in time, there's more uncertainty because there's more time for evolution to overlay the original phenotypes. For example, there's still debate over whether the very first split inside animals was sponges versus everything else, or was it ctenophores versus everything else, where a ctenophore is a so-called comb jelly. So they're still arguing about that, and you'll have to have a way of telling people about that.
I remember trying to do the research to establish, because we're putting this in manually, and we have to be able to show that it's all justified with with peer-reviewed articles and everything. So I think the tack that I took was that the first split would be parazoans versus eumetazoans. But again,
that's a little further up the tree. That's after the sponges and ctenophores and what used to be called Coelenterate split off.
Yeah, as I said, we're getting outside of the range of possibility for the audience, so I'm going to try to pull it back in. I want to try to read some super chats, and then we will go to audience questions. Does that work for you?
Sure.
All right, thank you very much. So let me see if I can select some of these. I've got a handful of questions, and my wife's going to take the questions. Super chat from Constellation Pegasus for $4.99. How does Christianity explain the sun eventually destroying the earth? Was Adam's sin so bad it affected even the universe? A defective sun, huh? I don't think we can answer that question.
Certainly not by asking me any, not by calling on me.
Exactly. And then
I think it's interesting because it's not asking how science would explain the sun destroying the earth.
Yep. And we also have another super chat for $3 from Lady Freedom Rocks. Thank you very much for that. And scrolling down, trying to distinguish the questions from the super chats. We have PhD Tony for Australian $10. Average people don't need detailed understanding of scientific disciplines. Is your guest frustrated by misinformation merchants deliberately exploiting this?
Sure. I think that there's a lot of, there's a lot of pseudoscience going around. I don't think I'm a big expert on it, but I know, for example, there's the field of epigenetics, which is a real area of work on DNA modifications and histone modifications. And then you have hucksters out there selling epigenetic creams that are supposed to modify your genome, for which there's no evidence.
Or they
sure,
claim
I think everyone is
epigenetics-
frustrated.
Or I've talked to one or two religious apologists who claim that epigenetics somehow disprove what they call Darwinism.
Yeah, well, that's there's basically these epigenetic modifications don't actually last very long, as far as we know, not more than a few generations at most. So I don't know how epigenetics is supposed to explain the evolution of over long periods of time, but they seem to be throwing it about that somehow the presence of this phenomenon makes all the work on DNA, all the work on anatomy irrelevant.
We have another super chat from David Soul for $5. Says, soon I will be a first-time grandpa and will rewatch your supposed lies in the textbooks and your phylogeny classification series with a granddaughter in tow. Thank you very much for that. And then another super chat from...
Was it my lies or did I write a book called Supposed Lies in Textbooks?
I'm doing a video series that's based
it's
on
yours, yes.
Yeah. So I'm
Okay.
sorry, they throw questions at me too. So another one's called Stop Scamming Man gave us 25 pounds. Says, I think we really need some videos on YouTube entitled something like Why Natural Selection Isn't a Random Process. There are trainloads of creationists with no idea. We aren't claiming it's a chance process. Yeah. They're always asking, do you think this came about by chance? No, you don't understand how deterministic processes work.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the arguing on blogs that I and other people get involved in involves people who have been listening to creationist debaters say that evolutionary biology is telling you that everything happened randomly, it all happened by chance. And of course, if they can get people to believe that, that's a big win for them, because you can simply look at the fact that a fish can swim or a bird can fly. And you know that random chance changes would never be able to make an adaptation that was that good. But of course, we have natural selection, and they're being told that natural selection is just random change, when in fact it's directed change directed towards adaptations of those species. So I think there's a lot of misinformation out there when people start talking about evolutionary biology telling you that everything is random.
They're just looking for any any excuse they can. One of the ideas they have in their head is that rather than understanding descent with inherent modification and how everything has descendants of different varieties and how it would inevitably play out in a dynamic environment, what they have in their minds is that you get a vat, you pour in all the chemicals necessary to make something, shake it up and dump it out, and then it is that living thing. It's a complete parody of science, an utter distortion, however far they can take that. One last super chat says, no, I already got that one. Yep. So I already read that one. Lalandra, are you ready to take over the audience questions?
Okay, here we go. How would Professor Felsenstein respond to creationists pointing out incongruences in specific regions of the tree of life, such as near the root, in order to combat phylogenies?
Well, there are evolutionary processes overlaying the results of previous evolutionary processes. There are misjudgments that people make in doing anatomy. There's even error made in doing sequences. There's error made in deciding which sequences, which parts of the, for example, the mouse genome correspond to which parts of the rat genome. There's all sorts of places in the process where error can occur. And so, of course, there are going to be discrepancies. There's going to be different people making trees that won't quite come out the same. There's going to be trees made earlier that are superseded by trees made later. And we have statistical methods. I've been involved in developing them for trying to indicate which parts of the tree are well determined and which parts are not so well determined. There's, to use the technical terms, there are bootstrap methods. I've been involved in those, and I know people who are heavily involved in Bayesian methods, Bayesian inference methods. And these are all methods that are trying to describe the uncertainty of the tree. Somebody comes along and says, your inference of the tree isn't perfect. Therefore, there is no tree. That's silly. I mean, we're scientists. We always have noise and error in our work, and we have to take that into account. And somebody simply pointing out the possibility of error is not really helping things.
That was another question I should have asked you myself, was can you compare and contrast very briefly in very simple language the difference between Bayesian conclusions and maximum parsimony?
Oh yeah, that's I have an over 500-page book on all the different phylogeny methods and how they relate to each other. So you want a quick summary of the book.
Is that inferring phylogeny?
The book is called Inferring Phylogenies. That's a very technical text. It's not a popularized book. There's maximum parsimony is one of the early methods that was used to make phylogenies. When people started using computers to make phylogenies, one of the criteria they used was to say, let's arrange a phylogeny, an evolutionary tree, so that the characters have to change as few times as possible. And the method was called parsimony. And so parsimony methods basically try to minimize the amount of change on the tree. Later on, people began to realize that with different lengths of branches in the tree and different rates of change in different characters, that we needed to take a more statistical approach. And there are methods called distance matrix methods, which take pairwise differences among species, make a table of them, and try to fit a tree to that. There's maximum likelihood methods, which use a probabilistic model. You have like DNA sequences, and you have a probability scheme for how they change. And then you try to use a calculation of finding that tree that makes the data that you actually saw most probable. That's a little hard to think about, but that's likelihood methods. And then there are Bayesian methods, which take the same machinery and add in a statistical description of what our uncertainty about the tree was before we looked at this data, and then out comes a probability scheme for how much support there is for different possible trees. So there are these different methods. They reflect increasingly complicated statistical models, or no statistical model for parsimony, but increasingly complicated statistical models, and use of things like prior information. And you end up with different methods, and then people squabble about which is appropriate. I don't know if that's the explanation you wanted.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure what I wanted, except that I knew that I'm confused about that. I've seen Bayesian analysis used to support two mutually exclusive conclusions. So I have to be a little critical as to how people how can they say that Bayes' theorem, proves this when you've got two different people arguing completely opposite positions, both saying that they used the same methodology to get there?
Well, they might not have used the same prior distributions, and they might have used somewhat different statistical models for what the characters were doing. It's very much like horse racing. How can two experienced bettors come to opposite conclusion as to who's going to win the race? They too are using things like prior information plus evidence that they think that they have accumulated about the horses.
I have a couple more super chats to read. Emmy.
Wait a second.
MEM.
Aaron.
Yes.
Before you move on, I'll raise my hand for a question here. All right. I think maybe one of the simplest ways to describe what you're talking about, where we group different species, is there used to be Linnaean taxonomy where people would take morphology, like which still isn't, it's not a bad thing, but you get stuff like false killer whale or stuff like that, so it isn't necessary, or killer whale in general. They're not whales. So what the way you're breaking it down is DNA analysis, and believe I don't quite understand the other part, the molecular clock thing, and so there used to be a clade called, not clade, but I don't know what the group called Xenarthra, and this was just basically all the mammals that have a weird nose that eat insects and don't have teeth, perhaps, like armadillos and pangolins and anteaters and aardvarks, and someone like you comes along and you analyze the DNA. You're like, wait a second, these aren't in the same group, and people start to realize this is a junk taxon where we're putting a whole bunch of things, we don't know where they go, and what you do helps them find where they do actually go, where the relationships are. So am I explaining it?
I think you're pointing out that people working on anatomy and who work on the very detailed comparisons of, for example, exactly where the plates in the skull of a mammal are, they actually made a lot of evolutionary trees in the past that were pretty good. And when molecular data came along, a lot of what it did was to confirm that. But it made some interesting rearrangements too. And we're not in a situation where the morphology, the anatomy, the anatomical data has been completely cast aside. What's actually interesting is that you're supposed to get the same signal out of DNA sequences, protein sequences, and other kinds of molecular data as compared to anatomy. But now what people are doing is we have such a huge volume of DNA data so much sequence floods in that we can do a pretty good job on the evolutionary tree of many groups using that. And then we can look at the anatomy and interpret it in light of that tree. We can ask questions about which characters are changing fast, which characters are changing slow. We can ask questions about is the change in character A correlated with changes in character B when you look across the tree? We can evaluate correlations between changes using the DNA tree as a resource and using the anatomical information. So people who are working on the evolution of anatomy, of anatomical features, for example, are greatly helped by having molecular phylogenies. So you were pointing out that there have also been conflicts and rearrangements, but I'd really have to say that it's remarkable how good a job the people doing anatomy did in inferring evolutionary relationships.
All right, I'm going to jump to some other super chats because we're going to knock them out of the way. So Amy M. Offers $49.99, says, enjoying the show. I fear my question would highlight my ignorance, but I am learning. Thanks. Well, MEM, if it means anything to you, when I see this man's accolades, I was just worried about standing on my own tongue. So I'm right there with you. Then we also have a super chat from Pattern Machine, $21. How do you diff, and that's in quotations, diff two sequences of DNA?
I think you have to first align them. If I take a sequence, let's say we take one of the molecules, the hemoglobin molecules in your blood. If you're red-blooded and you have hemoglobin in your blood, and it consists of hemoglobin alpha and hemoglobin beta, those are products of two different genes. If you take the DNA sequence for hemoglobin beta from a human, and you take hemoglobin beta from a chimp, well, you have these two sequences, but the question is, which positions correspond? If you sort of slide them against each other, can you find a match where there's a lot of similarity across, indicating that those positions, those are the corresponding positions? And you can do that very well between humans and chimps with hemoglobin beta. I think you end up with finding out that when you get them aligned right, there are only three differences in the sequences for the hemoglobin beta molecule. So it's not just a matter of taking the sequences and saying how different they are. You also have to work out which parts correspond.
Another super chat from Aaron Breeden, $20, says, that was a great explanation of the mathematical models to try to categorize the changes. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And next one is from II Arrows, who's giving €6.66. No, I'm sorry, €6.66. First time watching live. When I was young, I thought I understood evolution, but your series helped me to really understand it and how to teach it. Thank you very much for that. And trying to find a new one. Anton Gomez gave 66.6 Mexican pesos. Is there no way us layman civilians can help with the Phylogeny Explorer before the export problem is solved, data entry or whatever? No, not yet. Unfortunately, the database is only available to those who have a login, and at this point, it's not data entry; it's computer engineers that have to be doing this. I've gotten an update from the team leader on the design, or on the database engineers, who said, I think 4 or 5 days ago, that they've made significant progress over the last couple of months, but we're still not where we can start bringing in other people. All right, so the next super chat. Constellation Pegasus, $4.99. Any opinion on the molecular machines that organize DNA? I'm not good on biology. The motor that propels cells. weird stuff there. I think they're talking about a flagellum.
Yeah, they're talking about the discussion about, where flagella came from, what other cell structures they might share ancestry with. I'm not a big expert on that.
Well, as I remember, it was a type 2 secretory system. This was the argument that was made by Ken Miller in the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial.
You're off by 50%. It's type 3 secretory system.
Was that?
Yes. Yeah, I see now that in asking about molecular machines, I think the questioner is asking about molecular machines in the cell produce, from molecules.
So like ATP motors and that sort of thing?
Well, things like structures of pores, where it holds a pore open and things interact with it. It's the kind of thing I'm not very much of an expert on. But when you know what functioning, what structures a protein is contributing to, that helps you assess which parts of the molecule should be changing quickly, which parts should be changing slowly. Generally, the parts that are most essential will change slowly because they're already under a lot of pressure from natural selection to function. And so it's hard to make a change in them without disrupting that. And natural selection will oppose changes. And then there are other parts of molecules where the selection pressure is less intense. Those will change faster. So understanding these molecular machines is an important, it contributes in an important way to being able to interpret the DNA differences.
One last super chat that I have on my list at the moment. Whoop, they just popped in another one. So stop scamming, man, for £7. Thank you. The ID crowd put a lot of stock into the Precambrian shortage of remains. I guess in the last 10 years, they seem to have lost a huge amount of ground. Yes, I would agree with that. And then another one from Jeff Mason for $4.99. Thanks. Great content. Thank you very much for that, Jeff. All right, Lalandra, you have the next questions lined up.
Okay, here we go. With regards to theoretical evolution, this question is strange to me, so if it's strange to you, go ahead. But with regards to theoretical evolutionary concepts, do you have any opinion on whether the marked increase in homosexuality could have any implications on our future reproduction? In other words, would it suggest that perhaps we're evolving toward an asexual reproduction paradigm?
Asexual reproduction is a lot easier. You don't have to find a mate. I don't think I have anything informed to say about issues of gender, issues of sexuality in general. I think that when you're looking at things like how many people are doing this or how many people are doing that, a lot of the changes through time in human society are just because maybe things have become a little more tolerant and people are being a little more open about about their gender, about their sexual activities. And I don't think you have to assume some great biological change is happening.
If we were a parthenogenic species that could reproduce asexually, I just think, women would be wearing rubber gloves the way men wear condoms.
I'm not sure I understand the remark, but I know that species go to a lot of trouble to reproduce, and that involves finding a mate, for many of them, not all. And one of the puzzles in evolutionary biology is what advantage do they get? Does the species get out of that? Or do the individuals get out of that? That would make it worthwhile going to so much trouble. Why aren't we all dandelions? Why don't we just bud out? Here I am, and here comes my offspring, pop out of the side of my head,
The only two examples I can think of are egg layers, like turkeys and snakes maybe that are able to do asexual reproduction.
I think
Not
the
as
closest, sorry,
not as a
but
rule, but I think it happens in weird situations.
I think that if you look for species that can reproduce asexually, and you look for the one that is closest related to us, it's a lizard in Baja California called Nemodophyrus. And Nemodophyrus populations consist entirely of females. There are no males. And the females lay eggs, and the eggs develop into an offspring that's identical genetically. Well, it's an identical twin with its parent. I mean, it's supposed to be the same genotype, but maybe there have been some mutations.
What I
So
find interesting about that is that
yeah,
those lizards don't reproduce unless they have a mock courtship, which means that God has created lesbian lizards.
well, I think there's a similar situation in salamanders. There's some salamanders. I think they live in Ohio. Where there are species that cross with another species. The species there's like females. There's a species that reproduces asexually. I think I may get it wrong, but Amblystoma jeffersoni or something, where they can reproduce clonally, but they have to mate with a male from another species, have the sperm come and activate the egg, but then the sperm never gets into the egg. So clearly what's happened there is they're descended from outcrossing species, and they haven't quite got rid of that activation step yet, and become completely independently asexual. I think the interesting question is that people have agonized a lot about, done a lot of work on, is what advantage, there's an obvious advantage to being asexual. What advantages is there to being outcrossing that keeps the outcrossing species from disappearing? Basically,
Yeah, I didn't know anything about that example, so thank you for sharing that one.
Yeah, there's thought to be, well, under a lot of circumstances, basically, a species doing asexual reproduction will have a factor of 2 advantage over one that doesn't, one that outcrosses, and that's a huge advantage. So there's been a lot of head scratching over that, and it's not totally unexplained, but there's still a lot of argument going on.
I think just before we move on, that a lot of people with homosexuality and reproduction, they get really stuck on sexual reproduction as a means of evolution. And yes, it's really important, but there's some speculation that perhaps a gay uncle still helps the mother take care of the child. So, and the mother shares half of the genes of the uncle. So he's still helping his genes survive, or the gay aunt is still helping. So like there's other ways that evolution happens and genes are passed on, not just asexual and sexual. I think.
Yeah, that's so-called kin selection. That's a good explanation of it. Whether it is needed to explain variations in human behavior, is not so clear. But people have put forward that idea. When you explain interaction, excuse me, you explain a situation where any individual loses fitness to help a relative gain fitness, then kin selection becomes a very important way of explaining that. And you were right on target there.
Thank you.
We got one more super chat from Germania, $10. RN Raw, I used to be a YE seer, that means young earth creationist, Fundy Pentecostal Christian. As an atheist years later, your content educates me better than my homeschooling ever did. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. All right, Lalandra, why don't you pick up the remaining questions and any other super chats so that we don't have to bounce back and forth.
Okay. Now, this might be worth a mention. Someone said, Random Jack, I believe. Not a question, but scientists have discovered an ancient species of four-legged whale that can help explain the animal's evolution from land to sea. And that's 5 hours old, that news, they say. It doesn't.
You might look at Wikipedia sites for whales and talking about their evolution, because we have, in the last 30 years, there were a whole bunch of species. We mentioned this earlier. Whole bunch of fossil species of ancient whales that have really illuminated whale evolution. And the recently announced one it's another good one.
Okay. But I don't see why creationists got stuck on whale evolution, because you can see marine mammals now, like. Yeah.
Otters,
yes.
seals.
Yeah, exactly. Hippopotamus. Yeah. Okay, here we go. That's it. I think you got that one. Here we go. Okay, now Rum Racket 38 asks about the claims of evolution that you can't explain where the information comes from. Joe has some experience dealing with such claims from creationists like Bill Dembski. So what do you say to a creationist like Bill Dembski who says you can't explain where the information comes from?
Well, I in fact wrote a blog comment on that today. Yeah, well, if somebody comes along and said there is no explanation where the information comes from, that's a very common creationist trope. I mean, they really feel that this is a big problem. And I'd point out, no, we know about this thing called natural selection. We know, for example, that natural selection involves taking a small part of the variation that we have in a species and spreading it and making it become very common. Now, if you talk to people who work in information theory, selecting a small subset out of a bigger set is a fundamental information theory operation. You measure how much information there is by the small size of the set that you blew up to become the big set. So when natural selection selects small subsets of a population to have more offspring and to increase in frequency, that is incorporating of information into the species. They come up with various verbal formulations that claim that there's a problem and claims that there's nothing that can explain how information gets in. But natural selection is really important there. Natural selection is what does it. And there isn't a dilemma, basically. It's after all also what animal breeders do. They will take the variation of in an animal population and spread some of it, and that puts information into the genome.
Okay, so like they always say there's no addition of information, there's only deletion, but you just explained a way that there are yes.
Yeah, I mean it's adding information. And now somebody might say, well, the information was already lying around out there. And I might say, okay, maybe we shouldn't say it's originating information. Maybe we should say it's converting as energy flows through the organism. It's converting some of those changes in entropy into information. But either way, information ends up getting added to the genome.
What if they ask you, where did it originate from, the information, the genome?
in the
That,
genome.
yeah.
It comes as a result of the process of natural selection. And the process of natural selection only happens because organisms are reproducing. And that means energy is flowing in from places like the sun. So in some sense, it all originates from the flow of energy. I got mixed up between entropy and energy there. The flow of energy from the sun to the biosphere and on out into the larger universe is the source of the physics that ends up with energy in the genome. I'm sorry, information in the genome. I'm getting completely mixed up here.
In nature, you do see patterns emerge on their own, like crystals build, and they seem like it's being mathematical, but it's not a random process. But patterns do emerge naturally, like
Yeah.
our own genome probably. Oh, I'm sorry, probably did. You know. So, okay, so on that, it's kind of related. Someone asked about, can you explain horizontal gene transfer?
Yeah, I mean, when you make evolutionary trees using molecular data, you'll sometimes find discrepancies in which a particular gene in the genome appears to have a different ancestry from the others. And that one of the processes that can come from is horizontal gene transfer, which is just a general name for DNA moving from one species to another. DNA, there's a variety of ways that, I mean, there's the so-called "you are what you eat" hypothesis, where you eat something and some of its DNA gets into your DNA. But genes can move from one species to another. They don't do so commonly enough that it completely destroys the signal for an evolutionary tree. Most of our genes come from our parents, only a few from the hamburger we ate last week. You do see a signal of this. People are still trying to figure out what the rules for that are. But it's an important process, but it's not one that is overwhelming and destroys the whole idea of an evolutionary tree.
It was possibly only the major example I can think of horizontal gene transfer was between early unicellular organisms. So
yeah, I mean, there's how did our mitochondria get into our genomes? The mitochondria start out as a cyanobacterium, as bacteria, and you had bacteria moving into single-celled nucleated cells. So that's a symbiosis, and you have symbiotic events, you have hybridizations, and you have pieces of DNA just getting in and contaminating genomes.
okay, I think this is the last one. I don't know if I missed any. Y'all let me know if I did. Could the current human population tolerate a very low male to female ratio?
That was a super chat, by the way, from Raw Nakedness for $5.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you have to ask a sociologist. I think that if the question is, could our genetics handle it? Probably, but I think really there are parts of the world where the sex ratio is distorted, mostly areas where people don't want female offspring and tend to favor males, and then modern reproductive technology gets in and distorts the results of, it ends up distorting the sex ratio. But what the effects of that will be, I think most of them would be something you should ask a sociologist about.
Any more?
No.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for being on every show we've done. The idea was that we would talk to you for an hour. Excuse me. We would talk to you ourselves for the first half hour, and then for the second half hour, we would take audience questions. But every show has run over by this. I think is our shortest one. We've usually gone over by a full hour and a half. So, or we would keep the guest for a full hour and a half, just being really abusive to their time. And I'm glad we didn't do that to you tonight. I want to thank you very much for being on. And I'd like to give you another minute or two to make any last comments or queries or whatever promotion you want to say.
I will slightly promote a website. There's a site called Panda's Thumb, and it's just pandasthumb.org. I'm one of the people helping to run it, and I'm also active there writing posts and commenting. There's some very good people, very knowledgeable people there. The theme is evolutionary biology and challenges, criticisms of evolutionary biology. There's some others. There's some other very good ones. One that Josh Swamidas has one called Peaceful Science, where he's trying to communicate with evangelicals and get them to accept modern evolutionary biology. There's some interesting places out there to explore. And I think one of the things that debate on the internet can do is to people say, well, you'll never convince a hardcore creationist, and that's true. But there's a lot of people out there who either are sitting on the fence, or more importantly, who already know that evolution happened. It's just that they don't quite know how to argue about it with people. And so that's one of the areas in which blogs and other formats that are discussing evolutionary biology can really be helpful with. All
right. Well, Professor Joe Felsenstein, I hope I'm saying the name right.
You are.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being on.
Well, thank you both, and thank you all. And I will look for the YouTube video to try to see what it looks like objectively when I'm not participating in it.
Thank you.